It was the end of October 2013, a cold and grey day in South London. Just an ordinary McDonald's, one of those with shiny plastic tables, the smell of hamburgers, and kids running around everywhere. A little girl, 6 years old, walked in holding her mother's hand. She saw her grandparents sitting in the back, near the window, Neil and Linda Gray. Both of them broke into huge smiles as soon as they saw their granddaughter. It had been weeks since they last saw each other. Long weeks. The little girl, Ellie, let go of her mother's hand and ran over to her grandparents. She jumped into her grandmother's lap. Linda hugged her granddaughter very tightly, smelled her little hair, as if she wanted to keep that scent. Neil kissed his granddaughter on the forehead and took a bunch of treats out of the bag, little snacks that grandparents love to give their grandchildren. They laughed, talked, Ellie told stories about school and showed a drawing she had made. The grandparents listened to everything with the utmost attention, as if every word was the most important thing in the world. The child's mother, Jenny, stood there on the side, arms crossed, glancing at her watch from time to time. The conversation didn't last long, about 20 minutes. Suddenly, Jenny said out loud, "We need to go." Ellie then slowly got down from her grandmother's lap, gave them both one last hug, then waved her little hand as she walked out the door, smiling. Neil and Linda waved back and said, "Love you, sweetheart." Ellie then turned one last time, waved, and disappeared with her mother. That was the last time Neil and Linda saw their granddaughter. Months later, everything behind that meeting would be reconstructed in detail by the investigation of a criminal case. Because that was the beginning of a case that would shock the world. Marcos Campos, welcome everyone. Every week there are several episodes here. Subscribe now, check the notification bell, become a member if you can, and leave a like and a comment. All set. Announcements made. Let's get to the facts. Music. It all started in March 2006 at a simple birthday party in Sutton, London. Actually, the party was for Jane's brother, Gray. Jane was there, very excited, laughing with her friends. That's when suddenly her eyes met a guy named Ben Butler. He was a friend of someone who was there, leaning against the wall, casually drinking a beer. At the party, they started talking, laughed a lot, exchanged phone numbers, and after that night, they kept seeing each other. Nothing too official, like a relationship, just casual meetings. Ben seemed very interested in her, attentive. At least that's what Jane told her friends. But anyone who knew Ben before that moment knew that his life wasn't all that great. It was pretty simple, I could say. He had been unemployed for quite a while at the time and had a past that weighed heavily against him. Some thefts, witness intimidation, crimes for which he even served 3 years in prison. But it doesn't stop there. He also had a conviction for assaulting an ex-girlfriend, who was supposedly pregnant at the time it happened. Yeah, really serious things, right? Heavy stuff, but at first Jane didn't seem to care that much. Or downplay it, try to smooth things over. Still, when they got closer, Ben gave the impression that maybe he wanted to change something, to want something different. He seemed willing, actually, to try something new. Or was it just a strategy? No one will ever know. What I know is that 8 weeks after that first meeting, Jane found out she was pregnant. She didn't hesitate. She wanted to be a mother. She wanted that child. Then, on December 30th, 2006, little Ellie Mae Butler came into the world. A little girl with big eyes, beautiful, with long hair, who filled the house with cries and also laughter. In the first months, Ellie lived with her mother in a simple apartment, a one-bedroom place in Sutton, England. Ben didn't live with his wife and daughter, but he showed up there often. Every day he would show up, bring some things, and so on. And Jane split her routine between taking care of the baby and needing to work. She had a degree in graphic design, which was her professional field, but deep down, she also had a desire to be an actress. She even made small appearances on shows in the United Kingdom and so on. And over time, those opportunities ended up decreasing, and working as a designer became her main focus, right? What did she need to do to support herself and her daughter? And the ones who got really involved with Ellie's birth were her grandparents, her maternal grandparents, Neil and beautiful Gray, the ones who were there at McDonald's. At the episode's start, Ellie was the couple's first granddaughter. They became part of the routine from the very beginning. During the first few weeks, life went on as expected for a family with a newborn. Until, when Ellie was about 6 weeks old, she had to be taken to the hospital, and the doctors, when they started treating her, identified something very serious. She had bleeding in her brain, bleeding in her eyes, and injuries to her head. According to the specialists, that type of injury happens when a baby is subjected to a very intense force. Like in cases of shaking a child, shaken baby syndrome. I don't know if that's what happened, but it was clear that the hospital then called the police, given that right, this evident and possible aggression. And when the investigators tried to understand what had happened that day, they brought up an objective fact for the case. At the moment when Ellie felt sick, let's say, she was being cared for by her father, Ben Butler. Ben explained, right? When questioned, he said he noticed his daughter suddenly became pale, unresponsive, and almost lifeless. He said that just before, she was doing great, playing, and he denied having done anything to the baby. He stated that everything must have happened accidentally, and he didn't notice. And during this investigation, it also came to light that this wasn't the first time Ellie had been rushed to the hospital. Because about a week before that, she had already been taken to the emergency room with some burns on her little fingers and on her forehead. And that day, the one taking care of her was also Ben. He explained to the doctor at that moment. That's when he put the baby near a radiator, which he was adjusting, and maybe the temperature there. Maybe the child touched it by accident, which explained the burns. The doctor initially accepted that, remember, this was a week earlier. A report was filed, and life continued. But now, with 2 serious incidents happening in such a short period of time, the situation was already being seen differently. Ben Butler was later arrested on suspicion of having caused mistreatment to the child, serious bodily injury to his own daughter. Ellie was then taken from her parents and placed under the care of the foster system. Jenny, her mother, was deeply shaken by this separation. Right? The grandparents, of course, Neil and Linda, also started visiting their granddaughter whenever possible, within the rules established for that situation. Meanwhile, the investigation continued, and decisions were starting to be made about where and with whom that little child should live. What had started then as a recent relationship followed by the birth of a daughter, now it was turning into a long dispute, a dispute that would decide who, in fact, would be the best person to stay with Ellie. After Ellie was taken from her parents' home, she started living under the care of the system, as we saw, right, in foster care. For Jenny, that was a shock. Meanwhile, the investigation was connecting the dots. There, the doctors maintained the understanding that the injuries had not been accidental. The police gathered reports, testimonies, and reconstructed the events. Ben Butler ended up being accused and later convicted of causing serious bodily harm to his own daughter. And his sentence for that was 18 months in prison. Ben never admitted guilt. However, from the beginning, he maintained that he hadn't done anything to Ellie. He claimed he was the victim of an injustice. He said it had been an accident. Anyway, Jenny, his wife, stood by his side. Even after the conviction, she said she didn't believe Ben could be capable of hurting his own daughter. For her, that didn't make any sense at all, and her position had a direct consequence on the case because she decided to support Ben. Jenny couldn't regain custody of Ellie, and because of that, social services made another decision. Ellie would leave the foster care system and go live with her maternal grandparents, Neil and beautiful Gray. For the couple, that meant starting all over again, right? They were already in their 60s, all their children were adults, including Jenny, and now they had to take care of a child, a baby. Even so, they didn't hesitate. They welcomed the little girl with all the love in the world. The adjustment, of course, wasn't that simple, but it ended up happening. And guys, just a disclaimer here. Jenny probably couldn't get custody because she was involved with her husband, her partner. So, the investigation needed to connect all the dots to know what was going to happen. So, it was a moment of precaution, I would say. Well, as the months went by. So Ellie, there at her grandparents' house, grew up, developed her routine, started going to school, and spent every day with her grandparents, right? And the assessments made by the authorities indicated that she was very well taken care of. In August 2018 then, when Ellie was about 1 year and 8 months old, the family court made an important decision. Neil and Linda would receive special custody of their granddaughter. In practice, they would no longer just be the main caregivers. While something was happening, Ellie would be in their care, but now this was a long-term, not just temporary, arrangement. For Neil and Linda, it was a relief. They started organizing their lives, thinking about their granddaughter's future. School, health, routine. Now, he was part of all that. Meanwhile, Ben was serving his sentence. In October 2009, he left prison before completing the full 18 months because he got parole there. Shortly after getting out, Ben announced that he would appeal his conviction. He wanted to clear his name, say that he was the victim of an injustice, erase his entire criminal record, and Jane stood by his side. She was helping her husband. If that's what you want, let's do it together, honey. She then started writing letters to the authorities, to the press, to anyone who might listen to what they had to say. She said he was innocent, said he was a good father, that the case had been a pure injustice. And this appeal ended up being accepted, and in June 2010, Ben Butler's conviction was overturned. In the eyes of the law then, he was no longer guilty of the injuries suffered by Ellie when she was a baby. With that, the situation changed completely, and Ben and Jane gained the right to have supervised visits with their daughter. The visits were scheduled, had set days and times, and had to follow specific rules. In practice, according to the grandparents, these visits happened irregularly. There were even weeks when Ben and Jane didn't show up at all. On other occasions, they wanted to see Ellie at unscheduled times. You know, like they would call whenever they wanted and say, "I'm coming over to take a look." Even so, Ben wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted full custody of his daughter. He wanted to prove he could take care of her. He wanted a fresh start, to erase the past for good. And that's when the dispute started to take on a different tone, a different scale. After Butler's conviction was overturned, he started treating Ellie's custody as his life's goal. Now, from a legal standpoint, he no longer carried a conviction, so Ben and Jane started saying more openly that they wanted Ellie back in their home full time. He didn't just want a visit. He wanted the girl to live with them to support his request. So, the two of them started to put themselves out there more. They reached out to the press, gave interviews, and presented their side of the story. They talked about a mistake from the past, about an injustice that had been corrected, and about a father who just wanted the right to raise his daughter. Jane started documenting the meetings they had with Ellie. She recorded videos during the visits, Ellie playing, laughing, playing ball, arcade games she played with her father. This material started to be used as evidence of the good relationship between them. At the same time, he and Jane started questioning the care given by the grandparents. That's really unfair, isn't it? They said that Neil and Linda didn't feed Ellie properly, that they didn't choose the girl's clothes well, that they didn't provide enough experiences. They even insinuated that they weren't good caregivers, that Ellie wasn't being well taken care of, they claimed. The issue of their age, of course Neil and Linda were devastated. They denied everything. They said that Ellie was very well cared for, that she went to school, had a routine, medical follow-ups, a stable life. They also expressed concern about their granddaughter possibly having to return to her parents. Check it out, guys, how the details of this case are coming together right before our eyes. Because of all this, the case ended up in court. For the grandparents, it turned into an unfair battle, way too much of a dirty trick. Ben and Jane had access to legal aid to cover all the costs, God knows how, but they had it, unlike Neil and Linda. No. They had to give up a lot there, their savings, to be able to give their granddaughter everything she needed. So they used their savings, like I said, to pay for lawyers, reports, evaluations. Guys, it was their retirement money. Now everything was sent there for their granddaughter to stay, and another detail emerged in the case. Now, okay, let's make a side note here, but it's important for you to know, because while Ben was in prison, Jane visited him, and they ended up having another child. And for some reason, which wasn't clarified in the sources, maybe due to a gag order or something like that, this child was also taken from the parents, and Ben and Jane also wanted to regain custody of this second child. So the dispute wasn't just about Ellie. It wasn't. Time went by and the situation dragged on for years. That whole story. Ellie kept growing up at her grandparents' house, forming stronger and stronger bonds. And in October 2012, a new hearing was scheduled about the case. It would be the hearing that would decide Ellie's future. She was just a few weeks away from turning 6 years old, and at that point, Neil and Linda were exhausted. Financially, they had already spent more than £80,000 on legal fees. They could no longer afford a lawyer, and when the hearing began, they were without legal representation. Ben and Jane did not. They had their lawyer there. At the end of the hearing, a judge went there and spoke. So, the grandparents' special custody is revoked. Ellie should go back to live with her parents. For Neil and Linda, that was devastating. Ellie had spent practically her whole life with them. It was all she knew. Her entire family structure was there. Even so, the decision had been made. And who could go against it, right? The honorable judge? Shortly after the hearing, Ben and Jane appeared on a television show in the United Kingdom. They talked about everything, were interviewed about the legal battle, and spoke about the joy of having their daughter back. On November 9, 2012, Ellie went back to live with her parents. Their younger brother, the one I mentioned earlier in parentheses, he also came back. So, the dispute was over, but the story wasn't. When Ellie went back to live with her parents, she was not yet 6 years old, right? For her, that change wasn't just moving to a new address, it was leaving the house where she had spent her whole life. Ben and Jane also regained custody of their second child, which means the family was finally reunited. There were no emotional restrictions imposed by the court. There was no constant supervision. It was just the family. Within four walls, in photos, videos, and daily records, Ellie appeared playing, smiling, and taking part in activities with her parents. This material kept being used, right? To prove that they were excellent people, that Ellie was very happy, and the other child too. Everything was fine. Though living with her parents, Ellie still kept in touch with her grandparents. Not as often as Neil and Linda would have liked, but they still saw each other from time to time. Always, of course, depending on the parents' permission. As the months went by, that contact became less frequent. And on October 27, 2013, a year after Ellie had moved back in with her parents, Neil and Linda arranged to meet at a McDonald's, there in Sutton. They hadn't seen their granddaughter for about 6 weeks. They brought lots of sweets, cakes, basically junk food, treats for kids, but of course the most important thing was seeing their granddaughter again. Then, Ellie arrived with her mother. They had that really nice time together, but it didn't last long. About 20 minutes after that, Jenny said she needed to go. They said goodbye, then told Ellie they loved her. She replied as she was leaving, waved her little hand, and said goodbye to her grandparents. That was the last time Neil and Linda saw their granddaughter alive. The next day, October 28, 2013, around 2:46 in the afternoon, Ben and Jenny called emergency services. They said their daughter wasn't breathing, that she had turned blue, that she wasn't responding. Emergency services were dispatched, and Ellie was rushed to the hospital. The doctors tried everything, but they couldn't save her. At 4:01, Ellie Butler was declared dead. Ellie was only 6 years old, guys. Shortly after, a police officer went to Neil and Linda Gray's house to deliver the news. When the police arrived there, it was like It's impossible to imagine something like that. In fact, Linda already knew what it was about, right? The police officer knocked and said, "It's about Ellie, isn't it?" The cause of death wasn't released, but police were already treating the case as needing investigation. And that decision made months earlier in family court, that is, the girl needs to go back to her parents' house, would come back to the center of the story and shock the world. As soon as Ellie was declared dead, the police started treating the case as a top priority. A 6-year-old child dying like that inside her own home isn't common, is it? Ellie's body was sent for autopsy. Meanwhile, investigators began to reconstruct her last hours of life. Ben Butler was the first to be questioned. He was at home at the moment Ellie fell ill. The version he gave was very short and direct. He said that Ellie was in her room watching Peppa Pig, and in that episode, Peppa was jumping on the bed. The little girl wanted to imitate her. She reportedly had an accident, fell off the bed, hit her head, and was left unconscious. He said everything happened quickly, there was no aggression, and it was truly an accident. But he forgot there was a forensic investigation, right? The pathologist responsible for the autopsy found extremely serious injuries to Ellie's skull and brain. Half of her skull, just so you know, was crushed. According to the experts, those injuries definitely had nothing to do with someone who fell out of bed. One of the doctors compared the level of trauma to a car accident. Another pointed out that the pattern indicated at least 2 strong blows to the head caused by some heavy object with blunt force. It became clear that Ellie had been beaten, murdered. In addition, the autopsy revealed another important detail. By the time the paramedics arrived at the house, Ellie had already been dead for at least 2 hours. This completely changed the scenario. It's not as if the fall had really been accidental. This guy's story. Why did he only call emergency services after 2 hours? Investigators then started looking into what had happened before the emergency call. They found out that Jane Grey was working that day around noon. So, well, he called her and said, "Hey, come back home." And the security cameras recorded Jane leaving work. She really seemed in a hurry, running down the street, calling a taxi, and the driver who took her home told them about it. He was later questioned and said Jane told him her daughter was very sick and she needed to get home quickly. And he said that during the ride, the phone rang, and according to him, it seemed like it was her husband Ben, and he overheard it.
Você fez o quê?
And then Jane got home shortly after that. The police believe that when she entered the house, Ellie was already dead. From that moment on, the investigators understood that Ben and Jane started trying to cover up what had happened. In other words, she became an accomplice. It was found that blood-stained clothes were put in the wash, including Ben's clothes and also some of Jane's items. Ben left the house then to walk the dog. And during that walk, he also allegedly threw away pages from Jane's diary where she described episodes of violence at home, abuse that she suffered. But later, the police managed to find those pages that he had gotten rid of. And only after that, around 2:46 antimeridiem as I said, was when Ben and Jane called the emergency service. During the call, they followed the operator's instructions, tried to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation there, but they knew it wouldn't help because the girl was already lifeless, right? But all of this, guys, that was told during the interrogations and so on, the police were already cross-checking a lot of things, right? Their story didn't convince anyone. It was pretty far-fetched, right? The autopsy data, the time frame, the driver's statements, the camera footage. Recent history, and not so recent as well, right? The police started working with a clear conclusion about what had happened at the house. Ben Butler was then arrested on suspicion of murder, and Jane Grey was also taken in for questioning. And from that point on, the case was no longer just a suspicious death and started to be treated as a cruel, brutal, and cowardly homicide. After Ben Butler's arrest, the investigators started to dig deeper into what had already been considered since the beginning, right? The investigation now went beyond Ellie's death, focusing on what was happening inside the house. Ben was interrogated several times and kept repeating the same story, insisting he didn't hurt his daughter and that it was all an accident, the Peppa story, etc. When confronted with the reports, he started answering many questions with no comment. At one point during the interrogation, when directly asked if he could have done that to his own daughter, Ben replied, "Do you think I would be able to do that?" In other words, guys, he didn't say he didn't do it, right? He said he wouldn't be able to. Jane Grey was also taken in for questioning, and she wasn't arrested at that moment. She was heard as part of the investigation as a witness. Throughout the entire interview, Jane maintained Ben's defense. She said she didn't know what had happened, but she didn't believe he would have the courage to hurt his daughter. She said she had no reason to think that. The investigators noticed some details in her behavior. Jane never mentioned Ellie's name during the questioning, according to the report. She would say things like she, the girl, and there. During the questioning, she was given tissues to wipe away tears that never fell. Calling her she or the girl can be explained by psychology. It shows emotional detachment from what happened. Maybe, but let's see. While all of this was going on, the questioning and everything, the police were searching the family's house. The police found more diaries, notes from Jane, and that's when the case started to become clear, okay? Because in those notes, it was evident that there was psychological control going on. She said the following in some passages. Well, he is above everything. She also asked him to stop being aggressive, hateful, and violent. In another part, she said that she felt he hated her and that it hurt her deeply. There was also an analysis of cell phones, right, which started to provide data during this investigation. The messages exchanged between the couple showed a very unbalanced relationship. Jane sent texts saying that she loved him, that she was afraid of losing him, that she was obsessed with him. In one message, she wrote that she would die for him. But Ben's response was the opposite. He insulted her, humiliated her, called her ugly, called her a slut, told her to shut up. The tone was aggressive, constant, really a controlling guy. And Jane's internet search history was also analyzed. She had searched for terms like professional spell, make him love me again, urgent spell to make him regret hurting me, and phrases related to living with a violent partner. Man, it's really shocking, isn't it? What happens in a person's brain to put a jerk like that first, right? In front of his defenseless 6-year-old daughter, man, who could be a victim of a bastard like that, right, man? For the investigators, it was now clear that Jane lived under absolute control. Another fact came up with Ellie's detailed autopsy. Besides the fatal injuries, the experts identified a fracture in her shoulder that she had about a month before she died. That fracture hadn't been treated. Ellie didn't go to the hospital. She lived with probably excruciating pain all that time without being cared for, until it eventually got better, I guess naturally, right? Children's bones? As the investigation continued, look at how cruel that is. The police concluded that Ben had assaulted his daughter in a fit of rage, and that Jane, when she got home and found the child dead, helped cover up the crime. Based on that then, the charges were formalized. Ben Butler was charged with murder and cruelty to a child, and Jane was charged with cruelty to a child. Kind of an accomplice, right? And also for obstruction of justice. The trial of Ben Butler and Jane Grey began in April 2016. For Neil, Ellie's grandfather, at that moment, he arrived with a weight that was hard to put into words, you know, guys. Because shortly before the trial, his wife, Linda, had passed away. She had been fighting cancer for some time and died right then. Well, by the time of the trial, Linda didn't get to see the outcome of her granddaughter's case. Neil went through the entire trial alone. During the trial, the jury heard medical reports, testimonies, expert opinions, phone records, all of this that I told you about here. The version presented by Ben, that his daughter had fallen from the bed, was directly confronted with the experts' conclusions. All of that was nonsense rubbish that didn't match the facts, right, as presented by the forensic reports. Regarding Jane, the court analyzed her role after her daughter's death. The focus was not only on what she knew, but also on what she did after she got home that afternoon. It's about cleaning the scene, putting the clothes in the wash, delaying calling for help, he argued. The guy's version, she sided with him. On June 21st, 2016, the jury reached a verdict. Ben Butler was found guilty of child cruelty murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The minimum time is 23 years before he can apply for parole. Jane Grey was found guilty of child cruelty, and also for obstructing justice, right? Her sentence was 42 months in prison. I don't even need to say that the sentence outraged a lot of people, right? For many, that was just bizarre. Neil Grey, in fact, was one of those people who thought this was extremely in bad taste. He always said he believed his own daughter should have received a much harsher punishment. Jane served her sentence and left prison. After that, Neil completely cut off contact with his daughter, saying he could no longer maintain any relationship. After the trial, Neil began to seek answers beyond the criminal conviction. For him, Ellie's death was not just the result of her parents' actions, but also of a series of disastrous institutional decisions. Right? He questioned the actions of social services, the child protection system, and of course the family court judge from the family court. He recalled that for years he and his wife had warned that Ellie was not safe. Back in 2018 then, an official investigation was carried out to assess whether failures by the authorities contributed to Ellie's death. I don't need to say it. Guess what happened? Comment for me. The result was nothing. Based on the evidence, it wasn't possible to state that institutional errors directly caused the child's death. No, it didn't directly cause it, right? No one went there and killed her, but damn, Neil was devastated by this. He always said that if Ellie hadn't been returned to her parents, she would be alive. That decision was the point of no return. Neil wrote a letter to the judge who made that decision, right? In the letter, he only asked for acknowledgement, an apology, a sign that the warnings had been ignored. That request never came. In the following years, Neil spoke publicly about the case, whenever he had the chance. He says he wanted changes in the system that protects children. He also talked about the idea of creating an institution to support children who are victims of abuse as a way to keep Ellie's memory alive and help others as well. And Ellie's case, guys, ended up in court, but it never really ended. For those who stayed here and who really loved this child, this case remains a warning and example, right? Of how decisions made on paper can have devastating and irreversible consequences in real life. And how sometimes the clearest warnings are exactly the ones that are ignored, that no one chooses to listen to. Yeah, no one chooses to listen because they actually did hear them, right? And when you listen, understand the risk, and even so, ignore it, you decide to move forward. The responsibility also exists, it's not any different, but it does exist. Now, speaking directly about Ben Butler, about this scumbag, there's no way to soften it even a little, right? We're talking about someone with a history of violence, abuse, control, a cruel and cowardly man who knew exactly how to present himself, when to show up, and what to show, just to make it seem like he wasn't really who he truly was. Amid all this was Ellie's mother. I can't say if it was manipulation, emotional dependence, fear, or a mix of these. The fact is that she was caught up in this dynamic. She chose to stay by the guy's side, chose to defend him, chose to support his version of events. The result of this wasn't confusion or a one-time mistake. It was the death of an innocent 6-year-old child. It's all very unfortunate, right, guys? How can a system that has probably seen this happen many times before make the same mistake again? Based on what, man? Seriously, has no one ever seen a disturbed guy acting out? Those people who are like chameleons, right? Who adapt themselves according to the situation. Doesn't anyone realize they're being manipulated? I don't know, right? I'm not an expert in this, but there has to be a smarter solution, doesn't there? The guys went there, showed some little videos, some jokes. Oh, is that enough? United family? Happy. So the question that remains is pretty simple, isn't it? Why did this couple want Ellie back? She was fine, safe, she was happy with her grandparents. There was no urgency, there was no real need. When you take all that out of the equation, there's pretty much nothing left except a sharp response, right? Ego, control, possession, malice, empty people, lost in themselves, dragging a child along. Yeah, but I want to know your opinion about all this. The therapist's space with the comments is there. Thanks for your company, a kiss from the redhead, and see you next episode.